Imagine this: in the fog-shrouded markets of Victorian England, a man leads his wife by a rope around her neck, her eyes hollow with unspoken despair, as bidders shout prices like she's no more than livestock. This wasn't myth or madness, it was reality, a brutal custom where husbands sold their wives to the highest bidder. And the horrific reason? A twisted web of poverty, power, and forbidden desires that the elite buried deep in history's crypt. You think you know the prim and proper Victorians? Tonight, we descend into the abyss they hid from the world. Secrets that once whispered will scream in your mind forever. As we begin this perilous journey together, pause for a moment. Where in this shadowed world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Let your location mark the map of those brave enough to uncover what's been silenced. And if you're ready to commit to this path of revelation, hit that like button to affirm your step into the unknown, and subscribe to ensure no forbidden truth escapes you again. We're in this together now, venturing where others fear to tread. But let's not linger on the surface. The practice of wife-selling wasn't born in a vacuum. It slithered from the underbelly of a society rotten with hypocrisy. In an era where Queen Victoria preached morality from her throne, the working masses were trapped in marriages forged in hell. Divorce? A luxury reserved for the wealthy, demanding parliamentary acts and fortunes few could muster. So, the desperate turned to the market square, where a wife's fate hung on the swing of a gavel. Picture it: Smithfield Market in London, 1832. A crowd gathers, jeering and leering, as Henry Cook auctions his wife Mary for a mere sixpence and a quart of ale. She stands there, haltered like a beast, her consent a fragile veil over the coercion beneath. Was it mutual escape or veiled violence? History whispers both, but the scars tell of deeper wounds. This wasn't rare aberration. Hundreds of cases etched in yellowed newspapers from the 1780s to the dawn of the 20th century. Men, burdened by debt or disdain, paraded their spouses through villages, advertising in broadsheets, to be sold by auction, a wife aged 25, stout and healthy. The buyers? Often lovers prearranged, but sometimes strangers with darker intents. And the church? Silent accomplices, turning blind eyes as long as tides flowed. Religion, that supposed beacon of virtue, intertwined with this depravity, priests who condemned adultery in sermons, yet ignored these public trades of flesh. It's here we glimpse the first layer of corruption, a system designed by elites to keep the poor in chains, their women as disposable as factory cogs. Delve deeper and the horror intensifies. These sales weren't mere transactions, they were rituals of humiliation, stripping women of dignity in broad daylight. Accounts speak of wives beaten into submission, forced onto the block after years of abuse. One tale from 1844 in Carlisle: a husband, fueled by gin and rage, sells his battered wife for a sovereign to a coal miner known for his cruelty. She vanishes into the mine's shadows, her screams echoing unheard. Society? It laughed, called it folklore, while the powerful ensured such stories faded. But we unearth them now, pulling back the veil on a world where women's bodies were currency in a game rigged by men of means. As we sink further, consider the psychological torment. Husbands, often alcoholics or gamblers, viewed their wives as burdens to offload. Wives, voiceless under law, sometimes feigned agreement to flee worse fates. Yet the auction's gaze, the lecherous stares, the mocking bids, branded their souls. This was control incarnate, a manifestation of patriarchal rot that seeped from royal courts to rural hovels. Even the monarchy's scandals mirrored this. Whispers of Victoria's own consort, Albert, navigating a court rife with mistresses and suppressed infidelities. The elite's double standards fueled the fire below, where the masses mimicked their master's disdain for fidelity. And so the descent begins. With each revelation you'll feel the weight of history's hidden chains. Stay with me, the horrors only deepen from here. The fog thickens, curling around the cobblestone streets of Victorian England, where the stench of desperation clings to every corner. Beneath the gaslights, the wife-selling markets thrived, not as anomalies but as grotesque theater, sanctioned by a society that worshipped propriety yet feasted on cruelty. Picture a woman, shivering in a tattered shawl, her wrists bound by coarse rope as her husband haggles with a leering butcher. The crowd roars not with outrage but with amusement, her degradation is their entertainment. This wasn't just poverty's brutal arithmetic, it was a ritual of power, a public display that cemented men's dominion over women's bodies and souls. The deeper we go, the more sinister the truth becomes. These auctions, documented in crumbling court records and faded broadsheets, reveal a chilling pattern. In 1803 in Hull, a laborer named John Lupton sold his wife Elizabeth for 3 guineas to a drover, who later boasted of breaking her in like a horse. Elizabeth's fate? Erased, swallowed by history's deliberate amnesia. Such stories litter the archives. Wives traded for shillings, livestock, or even a night's lodging. The law, that supposed guardian of justice, stood idly by. Common law deemed these sales illegal, yet magistrates rarely intervened, their pockets lined by the same elites who profited from the status quo. The church, too, played its part, preaching submission while ignoring the screams from the market square. But let's peel back another layer. These sales weren't always about escaping marriage. They were often orchestrated by men to punish or profit. Some husbands, drowning in debt, saw their wives as chattel to barter. Others, inflamed by jealousy or betrayal, used the auction to shame their spouses publicly. In 1828, a Devon farmer sold his wife after suspecting infidelity, parading her through town with a sign, "Unfaithful goods." The buyer, a known brute, paid a pittance and her fate was sealed in silence. The crowd's laughter masked the horror, a woman's life reduced to a transaction, her agency crushed under the weight of societal complicity. This wasn't chaos, it was control. The elite, from parliamentarians to local gentry, upheld a system where women were property, their worth measured in pounds and pence. The Victorian obsession with moral purity was a facade, a velvet curtain hiding the rot of patriarchal greed. Wives sold at market were the visible scars of a deeper wound, a culture where power corrupted absolutely and women bore the cost. Royalty wasn't immune. Scandals of mistresses and secret liaisons in Buckingham Palace echoed the same entitlement, cloaked in silk and secrecy. As we descend further, the air grows colder. The psychological torment of these women wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Auctions were spectacles designed to break spirits and reinforce submission. A wife who resisted might face worse, beatings, starvation, or worse still, abandonment to workhouses where death was a slow certainty. The elite's silence was deafening, their wealth built on the backs of those they deemed disposable. And religion? It twisted scripture to justify this horror, sermons preaching women's subservience while vicars pocketed alms from the same men bidding on wives. The rabbit hole deepens and the shadows grow longer. Each step reveals more of the grotesque machinery behind these sales, a machinery oiled by corruption and fueled by human suffering. Stay with me. The next layer will unravel the twisted rituals that made these auctions more than mere transactions, but ceremonies of despair. Section 3. The air grows heavy now, as if the ghosts of those market squares linger, their whispers clawing at the edges of our descent. In Victorian England, wife-selling wasn't just a transaction. It was a ritual, steeped in a perverse theatricality that turned human lives into spectacles of despair. Picture a muddy village green in 1837, a crowd encircling a trembling woman, her neck roped, her eyes darting for escape that never comes. Her husband, red-faced with gin or rage, calls out bids while onlookers jeer, their laughter a blade carving away her humanity. This wasn't mere commerce, it was a ceremony of degradation, a public exorcism of a woman's worth, orchestrated to cement the power of men and the silence of the elite. Dive into the archives and the horror sharpens. In 1819, a Leicester man sold his wife, Anne, for a shilling and a pint of porter. The buyer, a tanner with a cruel reputation, dragged her away as the crowd cheered, her cries drowned by their revelry. Court records note she was never seen again, her fate buried in the indifference of a system that saw women as less than human. These rituals followed a grim script. Husbands advertised sales in newspapers, sometimes days in advance, like carnivals of cruelty. Broadsheets from York to Bristol carried notices, a wife 28 to be sold for her keep, turning private pain into public entertainment. The ritual's power lay in its visibility. It wasn't hidden in alleys but flaunted in daylight, a warning to all women of their place. The church, that supposed bastion of morality, was complicit in this darkness. Vicars, who preached piety on Sundays, stood silent as wives were auctioned steps from their pulpits. Some even blessed the transactions, framing them as mutual separations to soothe their consciences. This was no accident, it was a deliberate alignment with power. The elite, from landed gentry to industrial barons, profited from a society where the poor were pitted against each other, their women the currency of survival. The monarchy's own scandals, Prince Regent George IV's mistreatment of Queen Caroline, cast aside for his mistresses, set the tone. If royalty could discard women, why not the masses? But the psychological cruelty cuts deeper still. These auctions weren't just about selling a wife, they were about erasing her. Women were stripped of names, reduced to descriptions in auction notices: comely, obedient, or barren. The crowd's gaze, the rope's bite, the husband's betrayal, all were tools of control, breaking spirits under the guise of custom. Some women, records suggest, agreed to sales to escape abusive marriages, but their consent was a mirage, coerced by fear of worse fates. Workhouses, starvation, or the streets awaited those who resisted. The elite knew this, their wealth built on the despair of those below, their silence a shield for the system's rot. As we sink further, the ritual's true purpose emerges, not just to sell but to dominate. Each auction was a microcosm of Victorian society's corruption, where power was a blade wielded by men sharpened by religion and funded by the elite. The rabbit hole yawns wider, its shadows promising darker truths. What drove these men to such cruelty, and what secrets did the buyers hide? The next layer awaits, more harrowing than the last. The shadows deepen, the air thick with the stench of betrayal and greed. In the heart of Victorian wife-selling, the ritual's true horror wasn't just the rope around a woman's neck, it was the twisted motives driving the men who wielded it. Step into a rain-soaked market in 1840s Manchester, where a husband, eyes glinting with desperation, auctions his wife, Sarah, for a handful of coins. The crowd's cheers mask a darker truth. This wasn't just about poverty or escape, it was about punishment, control, and a perverse lust for power. Each sale peeled back the veneer of civility, revealing a society where men, crushed by their own burdens, turned their wives into scapegoats for a world designed to break them both. Examine the men who sold their wives and the abyss stares back. Many were laborers, trapped in the grind of industrial slums, their wages barely enough to stave off starvation. Marriage, meant to be a partnership, became a chain when debts piled or tempers flared. Court records from 1835 tell of James Taylor, a Sheffield cutler, selling his wife, Mary, for £2 after losing his job. His rage wasn't just at her, it was at a system that left him powerless, yet gave him one outlet: dominion over her. Others acted from darker impulses. In 1822, a Kent farmer sold his wife after rumors of her infidelity, the auction a public flogging of her reputation. The buyer, a local widower, paid extra for her shame, his intent clear in his leering grin. But the buyers, they're the specter haunting this tale. Some were lovers, colluding with wives to escape brutal husbands, but others were predators, men who saw auctions as markets for their appetites. In 1847, a Birmingham wife was sold to a factory overseer known for his cruelty to female workers. Her fate, like many, vanished into whispers of abuse in backrooms or workhouse cellars. These men weren't just buying wives, they were buying power, the right to possess and destroy. The elite, from magistrates to mill owners, turned blind eyes, their own lives steeped in similar entitlement. Look to the royal court. Prince Albert's rumored dalliances with courtesans while Victoria mourned her isolation mirror the same hypocrisy, just dressed in finer cloth. The psychological machinery of these sales was merciless. Husbands, stripped of agency by a ruthless economy, reclaimed it by stripping their wives of dignity. The auction's public stage amplified the humiliation, ensuring women felt the weight of every stare, every bid. Some wives, records hint, were coerced into agreement, threatened with worse: abandonment, violence, or the workhouse's slow death. The church's silence was deafening, its scriptures twisted to justify male supremacy while ignoring the women's screams. This was no mere custom, it was a ritual of psychological annihilation, sanctioned by a society that thrived on control. The rabbit hole spirals tighter now, its walls closing in with the weight of suppressed truths. What drove these men to such depths, and what did the elite hide behind their silence? The next layer beckons, where the rituals grow darker, and the secrets of power and religion intertwine like thorns. The descent grows colder, the air now thick with the weight of unspoken sins. In Victorian England's wife-selling markets, the ritual wasn't just a transaction or punishment, it was a grotesque mirror of the elite's corruption, reflecting a society where power was a currency soaked in blood and shame. Step into a 1850s Yorkshire village, where a woman named Eliza stands trembling, her wrists bound, as her husband auctions her for a sack of grain. The crowd's laughter is a chorus of complicity, but the true horror lies in the shadows cast by those who allowed this: priests, magistrates, and lords who wove a tapestry of silence to protect their own depravity. Here, the line between commoner and elite blurs, united by a shared hunger for control. These auctions were more than spectacles, they were sacraments of a twisted order. Newspapers from the era, like the Manchester Guardian of 1842, report a wife sold for a shilling, her buyer a tavern keeper with a reputation for collecting women. Her name erased, her fate, a footnote in a ledger of cruelty. Such sales were rituals of erasure, stripping women of identity to reinforce a hierarchy where men reigned supreme. The church, draped in sanctimonious robes, played a pivotal role. Vicars, who dined with gentry, ignored these markets, their sermons on female obedience echoing the auctioneer's gavel. In one chilling case from 1839, a Devon priest witnessed a sale, then blessed the buyer's household as if sanctifying the transaction. Religion wasn't a refuge, it was a cage. The elite's fingerprints are everywhere. Industrial barons and landed gentry, who profited from the labor of the poor, saw wife selling as a safety valve for the masses' despair. By letting husbands vent their rage on wives, the system preserved itself, keeping rebellion at bay. Royal scandals set the precedent. Queen Victoria's court buzzed with whispers of affairs and abandoned mistresses, their stories suppressed to maintain the crown's facade. The elite's own rituals of power, secret societies, clandestine trysts, mirrored the market's brutality, just hidden behind velvet curtains. A lord might not sell his wife, but he'd discard her for a paramour, her disgrace buried in gilded silence. The psychological toll on these women was apocalyptic. Auctions weren't just sales, they were public executions of the soul. Women, already battered by abusive husbands or poverty's grind, faced crowds that mocked their pain. Some, like Jane in an 1844 lead sale, were sold pregnant, their children's fates tied to the buyer's whims. The law offered no mercy, wives had no rights, their existence tethered to men. The workhouse loomed for those unsold, a fate worse than death, where starvation and disease devoured hope. This was control perfected, a system that crushed women, body and mind, while the elite sipped tea and counted profits. The rabbit hole's walls pulse with dread now, each step unearthing more of the rot beneath Victorian piety. What secrets did these rituals hide, and how did the church and crown entwine to bury them? The next layer waits, its truths sharper and more forbidden. The darkness coils tighter, a suffocating shroud around the heart of Victorian England's wife-selling markets. Each auction was a wound in the fabric of humanity, but the deeper horror lies in how these rituals were woven into the very sinews of power, religious, royal, and ruthless. Picture a damp market square in 1846, where a woman named Margaret, gaunt from hunger, is sold for a half-crown to a man whose eyes gleam with unspoken intent. The crowd's jeers are a ritual chant, but the true architects of this nightmare stand apart. The elite, cloaked in piety, who engineered a society where women were pawns in a game of control. The deeper we descend, the more their fingerprints stain the truth. These sales were no mere acts of desperation. They were ceremonies of submission, blessed by a church complicit in the elite's agenda. Parish records from 1834 reveal a chilling case in Nottingham. A wife, sold for a jug of ale, was handed to a buyer who later faced whispers of running a brothel. The local vicar, aware of the sale, offered no protest, his silence bought by the tithes of wealthy patrons. The church's role wasn't passive, it was active, twisting scripture to chain women to their fate. Sermons preached Ephesians 5 verse 22, "Wives, submit to your husbands," while ignoring the ropes and gavels outside. This was no coincidence, it was a deliberate alignment with power, ensuring the poor remained fractured, their women broken underfoot. The elite's corruption ran deeper still. Industrialists and aristocrats, who built fortunes on the backs of the working class, saw wife-selling as a grotesque necessity. It kept the masses distracted, their rage funneled into rituals that preserved the hierarchy. Royal courts, dripping with scandal, set the tone. Queen Victoria's uncle, King William IV, was rumored to have fathered bastards he cast aside, their mothers silenced with coin or exile. This royal disdain for women trickled down, normalizing the idea that women were disposable. In the markets, husbands mimicked their betters, selling wives to settle debts or egos, while magistrates, often tied to the gentry, looked away, their justice reserved for those with wealth. The psychological devastation was a blade honed to perfection. Women, stripped of agency, faced not just the auction's humiliation but the erasure of their humanity. Some, like Hannah in an 1851 Bristol sale, were sold after years of abuse, their spirits so shattered they stood mute as bids were called. Others, coerced into agreement, knew resistance meant worse. Workhouses where disease and despair devoured them, or streets where predators waited. The elite's silence wasn't ignorance, it was strategy, a way to keep the poor divided and powerless. Each sale was a reminder. Women were property, their suffering a currency that fueled the system. The rabbit hole's shadows pulse with menace now, promising truths too horrific for daylight. What twisted rituals did the elite hide behind their masks of morality? The next layer awaits, its revelations colder and more damning. The abyss yawns wider, its chill seeping into your bones as we uncover the sinister machinery behind Victorian wife-selling. These weren't just markets of despair, they were altars of sacrifice, where women's lives were offered to appease a society built on corruption and control. Imagine a 1853 Lincolnshire fair, where a woman named Ellen, her face bruised, is led to the block, her husband's slurred voice calling bids for her body. The crowd's laughter is a ritual hymn, but the true horror lies in the unseen hands orchestrating this nightmare. The elite, entwined with church and crown, who ensured these atrocities thrived in the shadows of their power. Here, the truth grows sharper, cutting through the lies of Victorian virtue. These auctions were a grotesque reflection of the elite's own rituals, secretive, cruel, and cloaked in hypocrisy. In 1849, a Derby wife was sold for a guinea to a man rumored to traffic women to London's underbelly. Court records note the sale, but no justice followed. The magistrate, a friend of the local lord, dismissed it as custom. The church, too, was steeped in this rot. Vicars, dining with gentry, ignored the cries from market squares, their pulpits preaching female submission while their silence endorsed the ropes. One 1840 case in Somerset tells of a priest who, after witnessing a sale, prayed for the husband's prosperity, as if the wife's suffering was divine will. This was religion weaponized, a tool to keep women shackled and the poor divided. The elite's corruption wasn't just complicity, it was architecture. Industrial barons, profiting from slums and factories, saw wife-selling as a pressure valve, letting men vent their rage on women instead of rising against their masters. Royal scandals mirrored this cruelty. Queen Victoria's court, rife with whispers of mistresses and illegitimate heirs, normalized the disposal of women. A lord might not auction his wife, but he'd banish her to a country estate, her voice silenced by wealth. The masses, watching their betters, learned well. Women were commodities, their pain a currency of power. Each sale was a ritual of dominance, a public reminder that the system favored men from pauper to prince. But now pause, this knowledge is a key, a spark in the dark. To lock in your transformation, to bind yourself to this forbidden truth, I ask you to join the ritual. In the comments type, "I see the shadows" twice, like a vow to carry this weight. It's your initiation, your defiance against the silence that buried these women. Do it now and feel the shift. You're no longer a bystander, you're a bearer of secrets too dangerous to ignore. The psychological toll on these women was annihilation. Auctions stripped them of names, leaving only wife or lot. Some, like Mary in an 1855 York sale, were sold pregnant, their children's fates tied to buyers with no mercy. The workhouse awaited the unsold, a slow death by starvation and shame. This was control perfected, a system where elite, church, and law conspired to crush the powerless. The rabbit hole beckons deeper, its truths colder still. What lies beneath these rituals and what horrors did the powerful hide? The next layer waits, unforgiving. The air is suffocating now, thick with the rot of secrets as we plunge deeper into the abyss of Victorian wife-selling. These markets weren't just rituals of cruelty, they were mirrors of the elite's darkest desires, reflecting a world where power was a blade and women its prey. Picture a 1857 Cornwall village, where a woman named Agnes, her dress torn, stands roped before a jeering crowd. Her husband, a fisherman crushed by debt, sells her for a shilling to a stranger whose smile hides menace. The auction's gavel falls, but the true architects of this horror lurk in the shadows. The church, the crown, and the gentry, whose silence was a pact sealed in blood. Each step deeper reveals their complicity in a system that devoured souls. These sales were no accident. They were engineered, a grotesque extension of the elite's own depravity. In 1841, a Shropshire wife was sold to a butcher known for his private auctions of women, a euphemism for darker trades. Court records, buried in dusty archives, show no punishment. The magistrate, a landowner, shrugged it off as tradition. The church's role was even more insidious. Priests, whose parishes thrived on elite donations, turned blind eyes to the ropes and bids. One chilling account from 1850 describes a vicar in Kent who, after a sale, offered a prayer for the buyer's new household, as if sanctifying the woman's doom. Religion, meant to uplift, was a chain, its scriptures twisted to justify a world where women were property. The elite's corruption pulsed through every layer. Industrialists and aristocrats, who built empires on the poor's labor, saw wife-selling as a tool to keep the masses fractured. By letting men auction their wives, they deflected rage from the system onto the powerless. Royal scandals echoed this cruelty. Prince Albert's rumored liaisons with actresses, hushed by palace gold, mirrored the market's disposability of women. The powerful didn't just tolerate these auctions. They enabled them, their own rituals of control hidden in private clubs and secret societies where women were pawns in games of power. The masses, seeing their betters discard women, followed suit, their markets a crude reflection of elite excess. The psychological carnage was total. Women, stripped of agency, faced not just humiliation but erasure. Auction notices reduced them to objects. A wife aged 30 serviceable, their identities dissolved in the crowd's gaze. Some, like Sarah in an 1852 London sale, were sold after resisting abuse, their defiance punished by public shame. Others faced buyers with histories of violence, their fates sealed in silence. The workhouse loomed for the unsold, a purgatory of disease and despair. This was a system of control, perfected by the elite, where church and law conspired to crush women's spirits, ensuring their suffering fueled the machine. The rabbit hole's walls tremble now, the weight of these truths pressing in. What twisted desires drove the buyers, and what secrets did the elite guard in their gilded halls? The next layer beckons, its horrors sharper, its revelations more forbidden. #### Section 9. The darkness pulses now, a heartbeat of dread as we sink deeper into the putrid core of Victorian wife-selling. These markets were not mere spectacles, they were altars where the elite's corruption was laid bare, their power a venom that poisoned every layer of society. Envision a 1860s Birmingham Square, where a woman named Clara, her face etched with cruel mockery. A 1861 account from Norfolk tells of a priest who, after a sale, blessed the buyer's new bond, as if the woman's terror was God's plan. Religion was no refuge, it was a shackle, its doctrines warped to justify the ropes. The elite's corruption was the pulse of this nightmare. Industrialists and lords, who amassed wealth on the poor's despair, saw wife-selling as a mechanism to keep the masses broken. By letting men auction their wives, they ensured rebellion never reached their doors. Royal scandals set the tone. Queen Victoria's court, shadowed by whispers of discarded paramours and hushed-up bastards, normalized the idea that women were expendable. In private clubs, aristocrats indulged in rituals of power, trading women like currency in games of dominance. The markets were their public shadow, where the poor mimicked their master's cruelty, selling wives to settle debts or egos. The psychological toll was annihilation. Women were stripped of names, reduced to lot, or wife, in notices that advertised their serviceability. Some, like Mary in an 1863 Leeds sale, were sold after years of beatings, their spirits so shattered they stood mute as bids were called. Others faced buyers with histories of violence, their fates whispered in tavern corners, men who saw auctions as a hunt for prey. The workhouse awaited the unsold, a purgatory of starvation and disease. This was control perfected, a system where elite, church and law conspired to crush women, their pain a fuel for Victorian power. The rabbit hole's shadows writhe, the weight of these truths crushing. What depravity drove these buyers, and what horrors did the elite conceal in their gilded rituals? The next layer looms, its secrets colder, its revelations more damning. The abyss is a living thing now, its pulse a drumbeat of dread as we near the core of Victorian wife-selling's horror. These markets were not just cruelties, they were the raw, bleeding edge of a society where the elite's corruption festered, their power a poison that seeped into every rope, bid and broken life. Picture a 1867 London dusk, where a woman named Lydia, her face gaunt with despair, stands roped before a jeering mob. Her husband, eyes deadened by gin and rage, sells her for a shilling to a man whose leer promises unspeakable fates. The gavel's fall is a death knell, but the true architects of this nightmare, church, crown and gentry, stand untouched, their silence a fortress of complicity. Each step deeper flays open their vile secrets. These auctions were a grotesque mirror of the elite's own rituals, clandestine, cruel and cloaked in privilege. In 1864, a Liverpool wife was sold for £1 to a trader tied to the city's shadowy underbelly, her fate swallowed by silence. The magistrate, a crony of industrial barons, called it tradition. The church's betrayal cut deeper. Priests, their coffers filled by elite gold, ignored the market's cries, their sermons on female submission a twisted liturgy. A 1862 case in Dorset speaks of a vicar who, after a sale, prayed for the buyer's new household, as if the woman's terror was divinely sanctioned. Religion was a chain, its scriptures bent to bind women to their doom. The elite's corruption was the heartbeat of this horror. Factory owners and aristocrats who thrived on the poor's misery saw wife selling as a tool to keep the masses fractured. Their rage turned inward rather than upward. Royal scandals lit the path. Queen Victoria's court, rife with hushed-up mistresses and abandoned heirs, normalized the disposal of women. In secret societies, the powerful traded women as tokens of dominance, their rituals hidden in shadowed halls. The markets were their crude echo, where the poor aped their masters, selling wives to settle debts or shame. This was no accident, it was a system designed to crush the powerless. The psychological devastation was apocalyptic. Women were erased, their names replaced with lot or wife, in notices that touted their usefulness. Some, like Ellen in an 1866 York sale, were sold after resisting abuse, their defiance punished by public humiliation. Others faced buyers whose intentions were whispered horrors, men who saw auctions as a hunt for prey. The workhouse loomed for the unsold, a slow death by starvation and disease. This was control perfected, a machine where elite, church and law conspired to obliterate women, their suffering a currency that fueled Victorian power. The rabbit hole's walls pulse with menace, the final truths clawing at the edge of revelation. What horrors did the elite hide and what drove the system to such depths? The last layer awaits, its secrets ready to haunt forever. The abyss stares back now, its final truths a cold blade against the soul. Victorian wife selling wasn't just a market, it was a sacrament of a society rotten to its core, where the elite's corruption birthed a world that devoured women's lives. Picture a 1870 Essex twilight, where a woman named Martha, her spirit broken, stands roped before a jeering crowd. Her husband, hollowed by poverty and rage, sells her for a penny to a man whose eyes gleam with cruel intent. The gavel falls, sealing her fate, but the true monsters are those who stood silent. The church, the crown, the gentry, their power a shroud over this horror. This is the end of our descent, where the darkest secrets of Victorian England lie exposed, and their weight will haunt you forever. These auctions were the elite's shadow cast long and grotesque. In 1869, a London wife was sold for a shilling to a man whispered to run a house of ill repute, her fate erased from history. The magistrate, tied to wealthy patrons, shrugged it off as custom. The church's betrayal was absolute. Priests, fattened by elite coin, preached female submission while ignoring the ropes outside their doors. A 1867 Hampshire case tells of a vicar who blessed a buyer's new bond, as if the woman's despair was God's decree. Religion was a weapon, its scriptures twisted to chain women to their suffering. The elite, industrialists, lords and royals, engineered this system, their wealth built on the poor's misery. Queen Victoria's court, shadowed by scandals of discarded lovers, set the tone. Women were disposable, their pain a currency of power. The psychological carnage was total. Women were stripped of names, reduced to lot in notices that advertised their obedience. Some, like Sarah in an 1868 lead sale, were sold after years of abuse, their spirits shattered into silence. Others faced buyers whose whispered reputations chilled tavern air, men who hunted auctions for prey. The workhouse awaited the unsold, a tomb of starvation and disease. This was control perfected, a machine where elite, church and law conspired to erase women, their suffering the fuel of Victorian dominion. The rabbit hole ends here, but its truths cling like damp earth. You've seen the shadows, the horrors buried by those who ruled. They thought these secrets would die with the women they broke. They were wrong. Now you carry this forbidden knowledge, a flame too dangerous to extinguish. If you're brave enough to pass it on, hit subscribe to join this shadow journey, comment, "I carry the truth," to mark your place among the initiated, and share this video to spread the secret. The elite hid these horrors, but we unearthed them and their ghosts demand to be heard. Stay vigilant, the past isn't dead, it's watching.